Welcome to Living from the Soul. This is Sam Terode, and today I'm speaking with my friend MJ. Online, you only go by MJ, not a last name, right?
Mostly I go by MJ. The M and the J do stand for my first name and last name, which is Michelle Johnston, but all my friends call me MJ.
And on Instagram, you're at QT Coach MJ. Facebook is the QT Plus Coach.
Yeah, so it's kind of a play on my niche. And if you say QT quickly, I'm the cutie coach.
Cutie.
Which is hilarious. But the Q is for queer and questioning, and the T is for trans. And the plus is because it's a shortened version of LGBTQIA plus, which is a mouthful to say.
Yeah.
So I've kind of shortened it up to QT plus.
And you are a life coach.
Mm-hmm.
There seems to be some controversy around that. Just a week or two ago, the New York Times had an article kind of bashing life coaches, saying that people should only go to a therapist who's licensed or studied psychology. But I'm a big believer in life coaches. So I wonder if you could share a little about what a life coach is and what makes it different from a therapist.
From therapy. Yeah. So first of all, I want to say I don't think one is better than the other, and often they can work together. So one of my clients sees me every other week as her coach, and she sees a therapist every other week. So we're kind of working together. There's a lot of differences, but I think the short version of differences are that in therapy, yes, it's a licensed field, and therapists work with people who have diagnosis, people who have things like long-term depression, and it's often, although in some modes of therapy, not always, focused on your past, like what happened in your childhood. Coaching can go there, but we're more present and future focused and not dealing with people with who are functioning, I would say, below baseline. So if you're functioning at like a baseline level and looking to just improve your life in some way, that's where coaching comes in. If you're below baseline, that's where therapy comes in and is more helpful. And some of the training that I've received is like when to know to refer somebody to a therapist. Like somebody might come to coaching, and in the process of getting to know them, like part of my job is to know when I should refer them to a therapist for, serious trauma issues or things that are more suited to a therapist that works in a specific modality, maybe EMDR or something like that.
Yeah, it sounds kind of akin to if you're in a medical emergency, you need to go to a doctor.
Right.
If you're doing well, but you want to be better, you might see an herbalist or nutritionalist or an exercise coach.
Right, exactly. So there's a place for both of them. I think we get a bad rap because we're not licensed like therapists. So it is upon me to make sure that I'm practicing ethically and training myself. I'm trained in a couple different modalities. And so for someone like me who's very much into learning and continuous education, like I'm doing that stuff on my own. But yeah, there's doctors out there that are licensed, that have gone to school, that aren't maybe the right doctor for you or aren't practicing ethically. It's the same in the coaching industry. There's people that have thrown their hat in the ring and don't do their due diligence, just call themselves a coach with no real training or anything like that.
Yeah. And I guess with any of these things, you just have to find someone you trust and resonate with.
Right.
Good or bad, or people who are appropriate for you or not appropriate.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I know currently you're specializing in LGBTQ plus issues and clients.
Mm-hmm.
Previously, you were coaching for political activists. I assume you still do that?
Yes. So if I get on a call with someone and we seem like we have a rapport and what they're struggling with, I feel I can help them with. Whether or not they're in my specific niche doesn't really matter. The niche is more to help me to speak to the people that I'm like seeking to help, as opposed to what I started off like when I was figuring out what I'm doing. I didn't want to niche down. I'm like, there's so many things that I'm interested in and so many things that I feel like I could really coach on. I felt niching down would be limiting. So I started as broad, and then I was like, I really want to help activists in the same way that I needed help when I was like deep into activism. And then really felt called more to coaching the queer community, especially because that it overlaps with my life. I happen to be queer, but also another like really big interest of mine is spirituality and religion and all the things related to that. And there's an overlap in that a lot of queer people have been harmed by religion and religious people. And so there's a lot of healing that could happen there. And so I have like a long history of just researching and getting to know the Bible and Christianity and theological thinking for my own purposes, and also because of my own journey as a queer person and experiencing fundamentalist religion like early on in my high school and early college days.
Yeah, I definitely want to come back to that. The thing that has been on my mind lately is because we're coaching for political activists.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not an activist. I'm an armchair activist, just consuming the news and tweeting out my frustrations. And that gets overwhelming at times, that, all the stuff that's going on weighs on me, and I feel it detracts from my ability to do my own work.
Yeah.
When I'm consumed with the state of the world. I think when I was younger, I was in a place where ignorance is bliss.
Yes.
I wasn't so much aware of all the injustices going on and all that's gone on historically in America and up to the present day. And then especially in 2015 and 16 with the rise of Trump.
Yeah.
That really began to consume and depress me. So I wonder if you hear that a lot from people.
Yeah, actually, and I've experienced it myself. I very much resonate with the ignorance is bliss, because before I was doing any kind of activism, my trajectory was information technology, and I was just like immersed in all things geeky computer and not really knowing what was going on in the world. And then I had the opportunity to get a degree from Pitzer College in gender and feminist studies. And that like really opened my eyes to like all the things that were happening in the world. And I actually had that thought. I'm like, oh my God, there's so much truth to the statement that ignorance is bliss, because I was just blissfully existing in my tech bubble, ignorant of everything else that was going on in the world. And so I jumped like all in on activism when I was going to Pitzer and getting my degree, and quickly got overwhelmed and burned out, because it's like when you're the type of activist that's like, you're always like in the streets or doing a cause, or like somebody calls you up and it's like, hey, we got to go march for this. Like that gets to be exhausting. But also I didn't have any self-care regimen. I didn't realize like, hey, you're quickly like draining all of your resources. That's what people think about when they think of activists. And that is one type of activism, but that I still consider myself an activist, even though I'm not out in the streets marching. I'm just doing a different type of activism, and it changes depending on where I am in my life, what I'm doing, my energy levels, all of that. But it's still activism, whether you're phone banking or signing a petition or donating money. All of that is needed and equally valued. So I just want to put that out there, that when you use the word activist, and I don't mean you, I mean people in general, that's what they think of. The Women's March, Black Lives Matter, like out there in the street marching, and that's just one piece of the puzzle. So you and I are still pieces of that puzzle. And the way that we can get overwhelmed is because in order to stay like somewhat educated, like there's a fine line between you don't want to put your head in the sand, and you don't also want to spend your whole day consuming the news, because the news is just all doom and gloom. Like there's not a lot of reporting on what's good is happening in the world. And there is good happening in the world, but that doesn't make for interesting news. So one of my strategies is I only consume 2 newsletters in the morning: the daily New York Times email that comes out and the Washington Post email. I don't surf Instagram or Facebook looking for like what's happening in the world. Sometimes I'll see that when I'm on Instagram. I'm a little more strategic in my Facebook usage, in that I've bookmarked like the groups that I participate in, so I don't have to go to the main feed and see things. Yeah. So limiting what I'm consuming is one strategy. And in terms of how I'm involved, I've also constrained in that area. So that's one thing that we talk about in coaching, is constraint, so that you can achieve what it is that you're trying to achieve. So if you want to make a difference in the world, like I do and you do, constraint is an important thing, because that's what helps us to not get overwhelmed and burned out. So I pick 1, 2, 3 organizations that I want to support, and I've unsubscribed from all of the other really good organizations who are doing really good things, but I'm just one person. I can't do all of it. I can just do my small piece. So I pick my small piece to work on, and that's what I focus on, and kind of like, okay, I trust that other people are doing the other good work that needs to be done, and together we're all going to make a difference.
But if you're on Twitter, you find out all the things that the New York Times and Washington Post aren't talking about.
This is true. I don't use Twitter. I'm on Facebook and Instagram. But also I feel like when like the really egregious things happen, it will find its way into my circle. So I don't feel like I'm going to somehow not know about everything. And I don't need to know about everything, because I've decided like this is how I'm helping. And I also have friends that are doing different things. So I find out inadvertently like what they're working on. And I don't feel the need to like join every battle. Like sometimes I will financially support a cause that a friend is working on that feels important. And I also kind of have to, like, you're right in terms of if you're on like whatever platform, you see stuff that, and you see like a constant stream of stuff, I think, especially on Twitter. Yeah. So there's ways to also kind of back yourself off when you're feeling overwhelmed, because I can consume a certain amount of that and not feel overwhelmed. And then I hit like a tipping point where I start to feel like, oh my God, everything, we're being redistricted and out of the voting process. Laws are being passed to prevent us from vote. Like all these things start to feel like they're adding up. And that's where, as a coach, I can self-coach myself out of that. And we teach our clients as coaches, we teach our clients to do the same thing so that you don't have to be reliant on a coach. But part of that is then, obviously, if you're getting triggered, to take a deep breath and like take a pause and think about things that are equally true. For example, I don't know if it was probably yesterday when I read about in California, the redistricting that's happening that's going to make it harder for communities of color to actually have a voice, like the way the districts get gerrymandered. And I was like, oh my gosh, that felt like we're doomed. Like that's what the brain is doing to me, right? We're doomed. Like if they can get California, like then my brain starts to kind of go on a rant. You can back yourself up. You're like, hang on. Yes, this is not good. And it's not like everybody's going to sit back and just let this happen. There's always going to be people that are going to push up against that and work for what's right. So that's a strategy of like, what is also equally true? Yes, this horrible thing is true and happening, but what's equally true to like help take the sting out of that?
I haven't even heard about this with California. I've been following all the other states, like here in the South where the redistricting is happening, or Texas. It's often like watching a slow motion train wreck, like seeing this election next year approaching, the ominous feeling of Republicans are going to take control of the House of Representatives and all these bad things will happen.
Right.
Do you have any strategies you use when this sort of watching the slow motion train wreck?
Yeah, because I am watching the slow motion train wreck. And again, it's like a both and. I don't want to be Pollyanna about it and also get overwhelmed and just completely withdraw and do nothing. And so in terms of like political stuff like that, I have friends that I rely on that I get information from in terms of, okay, I need to pick something to focus on because I can't focus on everything. So I think in the last election, I helped with letter writing in Texas and Michigan that were battleground states. So I get involved in that way, and I trust there are a lot of us and we're all doing various things and that's happening. But the slow moving train wreck can feel like everything's out of control. Again, what's really true also is that I never had control over any of that. And so I don't need to panic, first of all. It's not like things were in my control and suddenly they're out of my control. And again, what's also true is there are a lot of us in the game, and I always like to think of like, there's a lot of people that are a lot smarter than me that are doing this work. And I rely on those trusted sources that are doing the work day in and day out to guide me if I'm going to get involved. The other thing is, yes, I do think that it's true that the United States is, for the first time, I saw it worded this way on Instagram, for the first time is in the category of a declining democracy, which is frightening as a citizen of the United States. And I'm not going to just sit back and let that happen, but I also have some faith. This is where my faith comes in, is that I know in the end that even if things temporarily aren't working out, that they are going to work out. I do believe that, the arc of, how did Martin Luther King Jr. put it? It's like the arc leans towards justice. Sometimes it gets slowed down by people like Trump and the things that they're doing, but you can't, my underlying belief is that the creator that created us is like energetically, it's love. And so the universe is designed as a cooperative, loving system. Now humans we put kinks in that because we are not always acting from love. But I do believe that even when it appears that force of love is not winning, it will ultimately win. And that's kind of like a parallel in that let's say I could leave here today and get in a car accident and die, that feels like a bad thing. And it feels like a bad thing for all the people that are left behind, but I don't believe that I cease existing. So even like the quote unquote worst scenario, death, is not actually a bad thing. It's just a transition into another phase of existence. At least that's what I believe. As science, like energy cannot be destroyed, and I think of everything as energy, including myself. Like even when the worst thing happens, it's not the worst thing for me. It's temporarily horrible for all those who love me and are still here, but even the worst is not the worst. So that can kind of bring me down a little bit, and like, okay, the worst case scenario is even in that there's hope and there's okay. Like things will eventually be okay. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's great. There are times when I have felt so overwhelmed by seeing injustice in the world and such that I think, why bother doing my work? Like, why?
Yeah.
Why even bother, doing my writing and artwork and putting that out there? It doesn't seem to be making a difference.
Mm-hmm.
How do you advise people who have that feeling?
Yeah, I've seen that actually paralyze people, in that the systemic things seem so overwhelming. There's nothing I can do that's actually going to make a difference. And it's true that if you were the only one doing something, it wouldn't really be that big of a difference, but you are a piece of the puzzle, a cog in the system that without you, we don't make forward progress. It takes all of us working together. And I like to think about too that you are making a difference if you are making a difference in one person's life, because that has a ripple effect. So when I'm in the same way that when I was a jail chaplain, we had a saying that hurt people hurt people. It's like you pass on that trauma. The flip side of that is true too. A transformed person can transform other people by the very nature of your own transformation. That touches the people that you come in contact, who then touch the people that they come in contact. So you may not see it as like a grand thing, but your small difference, even in the life of a single person, does actually have like a ripple effect that goes out. So it's bigger than we imagine. And I think we imagine it sometimes to be small because we don't always get to know what effect we've had on people.
Like It's a Wonderful Life.
Yeah, exactly. He thought his life was so small and meaningless, but he had like such a huge impact on so many people's lives, like basically his entire community. And his entire community would have been different without him. And I think that's true for every single one of us.
I do think this is the most crucial time in human history that we happen to be alive. Mm-hmm. It's hard to see that as a blessing sometimes. It's supposedly considered a Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. And we live in the most interesting times ever.
Yeah.
I often think even 100, 200 years ago, people didn't know how old the Earth was. Mm-hmm. They didn't know that Earth had been evolving for billions of years. They didn't know that humans had been evolving for hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah.
And they didn't understand the impact we can have on the environment. Mm-hmm. Even say 50 years ago, people thought, oh, just dump oil all over the ground, it'll soak back in.
Right.
So yeah, we have so much more knowledge here about who we are in this world, but it's also, we're at this precipice with climate change and such. It seems the most exciting time to be alive, the most crucial time for humanity.
Yeah.
But then are we enough for this challenge?
Yeah, that's interesting. So Oh gosh, I want to say a couple of things. First, before I say what I was just going to say, I believe like I am not the physical body that you see in front of me. Like I have a soul, and I suspect you might believe the same based on some of your writings and the titles of your books.
Yeah.
The essence of me, the soul of me that will continue on past like the existence of this body. My belief is that the reason, or at least one of the reasons my soul is incarnated in this human form, is to learn to love and be loved. And when you were saying like the curse of an interesting time, how appropriate or almost like a challenge or a game to like, we are in a time where we're really being put to the test to love and learn to be loved. So it's like, wow, this is like, we have been set up to really like take on and learn to be compassionate, learn to be loving, because when everything's like all hunky dory and peachy, like, it's easy to love or be compassionate. You don't have to work at it, but it's, as they say, when the rubber meets the road is when you get triggered, when horrible things are happening. Can you live out your values in those situations? So this is a great time for that, at least personally. It is. But in terms of what you were saying in coaching, the basis of like, I don't know if you could call it a philosophy of coaching, is similar to like cognitive behavioral therapy, which actually goes back to maybe even further, but for sure, Epictetus, whose name I always have a hard time saying, that it's not what happens to you, but it's how you react that matters. That's in coaching. That is like the think, feel, do cycle. Our actions are driven by our emotions, which are in large part created by what we're thinking. So if you are thinking, I can't make a difference, why bother? We're doomed. That leads to feelings that lead to actions of doing nothing, to giving up, to not being part of the solution, which then is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If enough of us do that, then we are doomed. Whereas we would, in coaching, talk about how, if you want to make a difference in the world, what are the things that you think you might want to do? What do you, for you personally, like what would be the feelings that would actually drive those actions and get you up off the couch and doing those? And what is the thinking now that's preventing you from doing that? And how could you look at things differently? And not in a fake Pollyannish way of, oh, everything's fine. But there's, no matter what's happening, there's more than one way to look at it. And some ways of looking at it are not helpful to you, even if they're true. And other ways of looking at it can shift your emotional state enough to get you to do the things that you truly do desire to do. So it is important. And I think it's been said all throughout the ages in different ways. The way that you are, the story that you're telling yourself, that's how Brene Brown would put it, or the way that you're thinking about things is the beginning of what is going to manifest in your life. So it's not that I think things into existence in a magical way, but my thinking creates feelings which drive my actions, which then manifest things. So it's kind of like a chain that gets like set in motion, how we're reacting to things, what we're thinking about it, the story that we're telling about those things.
Yeah. I feel like I always have to be reminded of these things continually.
Me too.
You mentioned Epictetus, and I've written a translation of Epictetus. A couple months ago, I went back, in fact, and rewrote my earlier version because I wasn't quite satisfied. So I put out a new version.
Oh, nice.
It's called the Manual 21st Century Edition. They say writers work on things for themselves. Like I think and write about things that I need to hear myself.
Yeah, I think that's true for a lot of professions. I have friends who are therapists that have told me, like, therapists go into therapy because they need therapy. And so that's what they're drawn to. I'm drawn to coaching because I need a lot of coaching. It helps me in so many ways. And so I think that's a beautiful thing, that none of us are perfect. And so writers or therapists or coaches, we all need our own medicine. That's like part of the human condition. And I think it's a beautiful part, and why we're all meant to be in community with each other, because I can do some of my own coaching, but like the real hard stuff, I can't. From inside looking out, it's very hard to dig into. And so that's why coaches get coached and therapists see therapists, and, we're all helping each other.
To circle back to, you mentioned a fundamentalist upbringing, and I grew up fundamentalist too. So I'm interested to hear about that and how you followed this path to become who you are today.
Oh, it's quite a path. So I did not grow up in a religious family, and I was feeling like something was missing in my life, but I had no idea what it is. And this was like, I think the 11th grade in high school. And maybe part of it had to do with, I was adopted, and my family that I grew up with who adopted me, my parents were fantastic. They provided a home. They were not abusive in any way, but also we were not very doing things together. We kind of all did our own thing. And so somewhere around the 11th grade, I was feeling like very sad and like I was missing something. And a friend of mine in school said, "Hey, you want to come to church?" And I didn't know anything about religion. I didn't know anything about church. I said yes. It turned out to be, I don't want to say the name, but it turned out to be a fundamentalist, like born again congregation. And it was like a double-edged sword. It was what I needed. What I was missing was community in my life. And it very much met that need. And I actually was having such a good time, like going to church with my friend and getting involved in groups, so much so that after I graduated high school and I started college, I joined Campus Crusade for Christ, which was along the same lines, kind of an evangelical fundamentalist. I'm not sure how they would describe themselves, but I was getting the thing that I was missing, which was community. And I was really enjoying like reading the Bible for the first time and learning, what was in there and learning about God, and more and more and more, it felt very heavy because it was very much hey, you're lucky you're here because we've got it right. Everybody else is like outside the circle, is going, not going to heaven, and especially gay people. And at the time I didn't know, I felt different, but I didn't have a label for it. So I didn't really put myself in that category. But, I think my unconscious knew, like the essence of me knew. And so eventually I was like, it doesn't make sense that like what they're saying, that, somebody halfway across the world who never heard of Jesus, they're going to go to hell and burn forever just because they didn't get the opportunity to say the magic words to accept Jesus into their life. Like it just seemed ridiculous and it seemed harmful. And then for 20 years, I was like, nope, I don't want anything to do with religion or Christians or anything. And then a friend of mine, 20-ish years later, said, "Hey, do you want to go to a Christmas Eve service at my church? They're very progressive. We'll go to dinner first and then we'll go to this service." And I thought, well, I'm not really interested in going to the service, but I am interested in like going out to dinner with my friends and like spending time with my friends on Christmas Eve.
Yeah.
So I said yes. And when I walked into this big church, which was an Episcopal church, like my first feeling was, oh, this is like big religion, but I only have to suffer through it for an hour. So I can do that. And then it just so happened that by this time I was out. I did know I was queer. I was in a relationship, and I knew part of the reason I didn't want to have anything to do with religion was because the people with the biggest megaphones were very anti-queer. And I didn't know that there were other flavors of Christianity that were not so non-affirming. And so in this big church, what I consider to be big church, from the pulpit, positive things were being said about the queer community, and that being queer is a gift from God and God loves everyone. There's no one outside the circle. And I was like, whoa, like what? And so that really set me on a journey of initially looking for the kink in the armor of everyone is welcome, or here's the caveat. And I never found the caveat in the church that I was going to. And that was so healing in a way that I didn't even know that I needed to be healed, and kind of changed my trajectory. A few years later, I think like 6 years later, I'd been so involved in the church and getting so much out of what I was doing and being in community and all the people there, that I felt called to something other than being in information technology. And I wasn't sure what that was, but I was discerning, do I feel called to ordination? Which I did, but it turned out community was still like a big thing for me. And I ended up leaving information technology and joining an Episcopal monastic community for 3.5 years, discerning with them life as a monk. And it's quite a shift, right? Here I am in IT. I leave all of that. I sell my house. I leave my job, all of that. I join this monastery for 3.5 years.
And the Episcopal Church is not known for monastics. I think of Catholic and Orthodox. So
yes.
I'm not even sure I was aware of that. Or how widespread is that? Are there about 10 Episcopal monks?
They're mostly Catholic and Orthodox. You're right. There's a very small, I think at the time the number was like 2,000 throughout the United States. So the Episcopal Church is the Anglican Church in the United States. And comparatively, that's like a drop in the bucket to Catholicism. And most of the monastics that I was learning from were all Catholics. Richard Rohr and Thomas Merton and Joan Chittister, we're babies in that sense compared to the Roman Catholic Church. So discernment to be like a monk for life is 4.5 years, and 3.5 years in, I realized like I'm not called to like live in the monastery my whole life, because I didn't feel like I was living to my full potential. But the most beautiful part of that journey was that I got to be a jail chaplain for 3.5 years. And that in unexpected ways changed me forever in terms of learning to be more compassionate, understanding the journey of people who have lived lives that were extremely different from my own. It really took a lot of the judgment out of me of, I used to be very much, if you do the crime, then you should do the time, not knowing, like, first of all, it's like there's humans involved in this, but there's a backstory to everything. And again, circling back to hurt people, like everyone in jail has come from a background that didn't make it easy for them to succeed in a way that I did, whereas my background made it so much more easier for me to not turn to a life of crime. I didn't get born into a gang family. I didn't get born into violence. I didn't get born into trauma. So sitting with these women, I worked in the women's jail, and hearing their stories, gosh, I just really got to experience humanity in a different way that changed my heart. It changed my attitude. And that's why compassion is very much a part of like my coaching and my philosophy of life, even though I definitely don't do it perfectly, but I strive. That is what I strive for, to be compassionate and understanding to everyone, even the people that really like make me mad, like Trump. I mean, I'll be honest, like I do also believe like what can help me give compassion towards him is that he is acting out his unprocessed trauma. And if anyone is like in need of a trauma therapist, it is him. And it's not that, we just have compassion and like let him wreak havoc on the nation, but we can get him out of office, but also recognize he is still a human. He is still a human that's acting out his hurts and his trauma. We don't have to dehumanize him in the process, because all I think that does is like make people dig in their heels. It feels good in the moment to like make fun of him, but I really don't. If my goal is to like make the world a better place, that has to involve everyone, including the people that I disagree with and that I feel are really doing harm. It's not helpful to dehumanize them. It's like you becoming the oppressor. So like, it's like the oppressed becoming the oppressor. That's not helpful to anybody.
Yeah, I had that thought the other day. I've often been caught up in the lock him up. We want to see Trump and all of his henchmen go to jail for a long time.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, well, I really don't want that for anyone. It's more I want to see their power taken away. Like I would like to see Congress step up and pass something to stop him from being able to hold office again, for instance. Just to take their power and some of their money away.
Yeah, he does need to be prevented from continuing the harm that he's inflicting on the nation, the harm that he's acting out, in the same way that like somebody who commits murder, it's not that they should get away with that murder because it's what led up to that is their own dehumanization and trauma. They still need to be held accountable, but in a restorative way that helps them become a productive member of society, if that is possible for them. And for our own protection, they should be taken out of society. But the problem is our injustice system. I don't know if it's a justice system, but the system that we call justice is set up that it makes people's lives worse when they go through that system, instead of rehabilitating them and turning them into productive citizens that can live alongside of us. That's the problem, again, is the system that we have for holding people accountable. It's really beats people down instead of just holding them accountable.
Yeah, and this idea of punishment, it might tie in with people's views of God, like the people who created this justice system.
Yeah.
That's how they view God in relation to humanity.
Yeah, and I think that's a misinterpretation of God, because like if you read the Psalms, the psalmists are like often wailing and like asking, for their enemies to be smited down and justice to be brought, but they let God take care of the justice. They recognize that it wasn't their place to like bring down that justice on their enemies, that was God's to do. So they're crying out to God, like, please smite my enemy down, but they didn't go do it themselves because it wasn't their place. So that's my underlying philosophy is, as a Christian, the most important commandment that Jesus gave me is to love God, love my neighbor, and love myself. That has to be the starting point of everything. And I then trust that whatever justice I desire, that God will mete out whatever needs to be meted out. But in terms of justice here in the human, like physical space that we're in now, to me, justice means helping people out of poverty, ending systemic racism, like ending sexism. It's not about punishment. It's about dismantling and getting rid of the systems of oppression that make it hard for people to exist. Yeah,
that's great. I have to ask, do Episcopal monks have to be celibate?
Yes. So 3.5 years. And I should put a caveat on that. There are dispersed communities where celibacy is not part of the vows. So like Anam Cara is an Episcopal religious community that doesn't have celibacy as one of the vows that they take. But the monastery that I happened to join was like the traditional that you think about, where it's like a group of people living in, a building together. They're all celibate. They've got a vow of, poverty and chastity and all of that.
I do think that throughout Christian history, it's caused a lot of problems, like this demand of celibacy and the priesthood and the monks and such. Now, there are some people called to that, or that's just their nature. They may be asexual, and that's easy for them. I think it causes a lot of problems to put that as a demand on people, and just to associate it as well, to be the closest to God, you have to be celibate.
I also think a lot of queer people joined monastic communities because in their generation, it wasn't okay to be queer. So if you're like a lesbian and you're not going to marry, and you were brought up in a faith that makes it not okay to be queer, like what a good option to just join a community of women and hang out with women all day, regardless of whether like you're not having a sexual relationship, but you aren't forced into like a heterosexual marriage that you don't feel called to either. So there was, in the monastic communities that I was like getting to meet and getting to be involved with, there was a high number of queer people in those communities. And so I do think some of it was that. And I also think there's a difference between, joining like of your own, whether you're asexual or you're just called to it, or whatever the reason is. The Catholic Church, if you look at the history of the Roman Catholic Church, that switching, it wasn't always that priests had to be celibate. It was a big land grab to get the resources of the priests, so if you can't marry and you can't have a family, all that now became part of the Catholic Church. And I think it's had a devastating effect, because I don't believe that most of us are meant to live a celibate life. We're relational creatures. And part of that, most of us, not everybody, but we have that desire to be in relationship in many ways, including in a romantic relationship.
Yeah. I was really surprised to see that you just recently became a priest.
Yeah.
So so tell me a little about that.
So that call, if you will, never really went away after I was discerning with my parish to become an Episcopal priest. But then I ultimately joined the monastery, and I was in the monastery discerning to be ordained as a priest. And when I left the monastery, I thought, well, that ship has sailed. And I'm not the type of person to like lament for a long time on like things that could have been, would have been, or that I wanted, but aren't going to be. So I just kind of moved on and had a year after I left the monastery. I had a year of just saying yes and trying to figure out, what am I doing? And I found coaching and really felt drawn to that. And when I left the monastery, it was not a pleasant parting. There was a lot of upset. There was a lot of hurt feelings. And so there were several years after leaving that I felt wounded enough from that experience that, again, I kind of withdrew from like the diocese that we were a part of, and the pandemic hit. So then that made it easy to kind of withdraw from church because Zoom church wasn't really doing it for me. So as I felt like I was healing from that, through coaching, through spiritual direction, through artistic expression, I was just feeling like, okay, I feel like I want to re-engage in community, in my local diocese. And a friend of mine who used to live here in California and was on track to be a priest in the Episcopal Church, but then moved to New Mexico, he got involved with there's many progressive offshoots from the Roman Catholic Church, and he grew up Roman Catholic. So he got involved in one of those groups and was a priest, and then he became a bishop. And then when that group, he felt like, was starting to go back to very rigid doctrinal, like not the inclusive, warm welcome, like tenets that caused him to join. As a bishop, he started his own church and also wanted to build community. So started a dispersed Franciscan friary. In the Franciscan tradition, it's not called a monastery, it's called a friary, and they're not called monks, they're called friars. He was really drawn to St. Francis, and so started these two communities. And right at the time when I was feeling like I wanted to re-engage, he said, "Do you still feel called to be a priest?" And I thought about it, and I did. And so I said yes. And it all in my life, like the way that I, like the Holy Spirit, and I have like the Holy Spirit has worked in my life. It's like things, when it's the right timing, like things just kind of like fall down like dominoes. And that started happening. It's a really, like I was saying earlier, it's a really supportive, I guess, or like a kinship to the coaching that I'm doing, in terms of queer people have had a lot of religious trauma that they've had to work through. And I've gone through all of that in a lot of my training. And I still had that calling to be a priest. And, it turns out, according to Molly, my partner, I was meant to be preaching, because when I gave my first sermon, she's like, "Oh, like this is the venue that MJ has needed," because apparently a version of that had been happening at home. I didn't know that I was preaching, and Molly couldn't figure out what was happening. She was just like, "Oh, this is like too much for me. Like, what's happening?" And so it's like she clicked. She's like, "I'm so happy that you have this venue now where like you can preach it, and you don't have to like preach it at home. You can you can do it outside." So like I've also been one, I've always felt like God is a creative force, like the creator, like the source of creativity. And so the idea that all of us are just called to one very specific vocation in life, and we have to figure out what that is. I think we're called to multiple things. And so I'm called to coaching and being a priest, and I think they work very well together. And I feel very like I feel whole again now that it's very new. It's been like a few weeks since I was ordained, and it has felt like so healing, and I feel so whole, and I feel now like it's starting to mesh with my coaching. And so, yeah, I mean, we're obviously, as a queer person, it's important to me that whatever group I'm involved in is very inclusive and welcoming. And so that is the mission. The foundation is my foundation. Love God, love your neighbor, love yourself. We ordain gay people, straight people, trans people, male, female. We're trying to build community and faith in a way that's like, it has structure, and we do honor the sacraments, and we're liturgical because like ritual just feels good, but not in a rigid bureaucratic way. Even in terms of ordination, that your path to ordination can look different from my path to ordination. It doesn't all have to be spend a lot of money on seminary and discern at your church and then go away for a year here. And then, it's I can't speak to any other faith except for the Episcopal Church, but the ordination process in the Episcopal Church is not a life-giving process, which is ironic. It should be a life-giving process. It shouldn't be a process that beats you down. And if you survive, I guess you were really called to be a priest. It's like, a friend of mine was like, you know what? All of her friends who have gone through that process, she's like, the healthiest of them dropped out of that process because the process was so unhealthy. And so that's another thing that we're trying to change, and in addition to just welcoming everybody and being inclusive of everyone.
What's the name of your denomination or church?
So it's kind of like the way I describe it is Anglo-Catholic. That's probably how my friend would say it. It's the Apostolic Sacramental Church. And the name says like what we are in terms of apostolic, meaning our ordination comes down through the similar apostolic line of the Roman Catholic Church. So all the way from way back, the laying on of hands and ordaining, like we're part of that apostolic tradition. Sacramental, because we do the 7 sacraments. So, the liturgy and the baptism and all of that. And then progressive, and also like some of the people they come from a Roman Catholic tradition. And so when they do liturgy, it's very much closer to the Roman Catholic way of doing liturgy. I come from an Anglican tradition. And so when I do liturgy, that's what feels good to me. So there's no requirement in terms of we are Anglicans or we are progressive Catholics. That's another no, as a ordained priest, you get to decide how do you want to live out your vocation. And that can be flavored Anglican. It can be flavored Catholic. There's one of our priests, it happens to be also, I don't know if ordained is the right word, but in the Zen Buddhist tradition. So he's like melds those Zen Buddhism and Christianity together. So it's very, very much how I believe. There's no one religion that has the answers. Like you can't, it seems silly to try to put God into like one specific religious box or any kind of box. I think there's truth to be had in all the faith traditions. And if you look at the core of like all the major traditions, it is about love and making the world a better place, I think. So we honor all of that. We're not exclusive like the tradition that, when I was in high school, it's like, nope, our way is the right way and everybody else is burning in hell. Not like that.
Yeah, well, it's great that you're spreading this within Christianity.
Yeah, whereas
And
I originally turned away from it because I was just like so disgusted by all the harm that was being done by Christianity. Now my view is Christianity and religion is not going away. And so I think there's value to, infiltrating and changing it from the inside out to be a force for good instead of a force for harm.
yeah, it's very, very interesting to me when someone like you, despite the harm you experience and such, stays within the church.
Mm-hmm.
Because I didn't have the church didn't have any doctrine against me, but I still left. So.
Yeah. And that's okay too. I mean, again, I think that's the same with, that we were talking about with activism. Like we all have different roles to play. And for some people, it's not within the church. And that doesn't mean that they don't have a faith or a spirituality, but you know what? That's you all, more the power to you. You go take on that, and I'm going to go take on this over here. And I think it's all equally valuable.
Yeah, that's great. You're definitely very needed where you are. So
thank you. As are you. I love what you're doing and the writings that you're doing. And I do think that part of what keeps the humanity in humanity is the arts, writing and music and poetry. And without that, we become devoid of empathy and feeling and love. And there's trauma is one reason, but also I think that has like stripping schools of the arts when funds are low, like it leads to the creation of a society that's just lacking in their own humanity. And then that gets played out like what's happening in the Republican Party. I don't think they weren't always this hateful and vitriolic and wanting to destroy democracy. I think that happened over time, and that I think is a piece of it.
Well, thanks so much for taking time to talk. It's been great.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I'm really excited to have had this opportunity to talk to you.
Thanks for listening to Living from the Soul. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and review. This is an ad-free podcast brought to you by my books, which are available at samterode.com. The theme music was created by Gideon Terode.